First unit of the grade 12 university chemistry course deals with organic chemistry. You will explore the structure, properties, and chemical behavior of compounds within each class of organic compounds. So what is an organic compound? It is a compound that contains carbons bonded to each other to hydrogen atoms and sometimes sulfur, phosphorus, nitrogen, and oxygen atoms. Inorganic compounds are compounds that do not contain carbon atoms, or if they do, they are carbonates, cyanides, carbides, carbon dioxide, and carbon monoxide. All of those 5 examples contain carbon but are considered inorganic compounds. Carbon can make covalent bonds with 4 different atoms, so it can make thousands of different molecules. There are different ways to represent organic compounds. 3 of them are listed here. Molecular formula. This will indicate the number and type of atoms present in a compound. For example, CH4 is the molecular formula for methane. 1 carbon bonded to 4 hydrogens. C5H12 is the molecular formula for pentane. It contains 5 carbons and a total of 12 hydrogens. It doesn't tell you anything about how they're bonded. The structural formula shows the placements of bonds and atoms. So the structural formula for methane will be 1 carbon, draw the 4 covalent bonds that it makes, and then put in your hydrogens. So this shows the bonds and the hydrogens. If you were going to do the structural formula for, let's say, pentane C5H12, you would show your carbon chain. There's 5 carbons. Each carbon can have a total of 4 bonds. So the end carbon get an extra 3, and then all the inside ones get an extra 2. And then you place your hydrogens. And this is the structural formula for pentane. So it shows the atoms and the bonds. A condensed formula is basically a combination of structural and molecular formula. It shows the atoms in bonding order, but not the actual bonds. CH4 condensed formula will be the same. It's just CH4 because there's no more carbons. But for pentane, C5H12, we have first right here a carbon with 3 hydrogens. So you would write CH3. And then we have a carbon with 2 hydrogens. So you would write CH2. That's followed by another CH2, another CH2, and then the CH3. So it's like a molecular formula, except it shows you basically the bonding order of the atoms bonded to the carbons. So right now what I'd like you to do is draw the structural formula and the condensed formula for propane. Which is C3H8. So the structural formula and condensed formula for that. Pause the video and then check your answers. Okay, so C3, so carbon chain is 3 carbons long. Put in your bonds, place your atoms. So there's our structural formula. And then the condensed formula would be CH3, CH2, CH3. Compounds that have the same molecular formula but different structural formulas are called isomers. So there's structural isomers, also called constitutional isomers. that have a different bonding arrangement. So in order to do this, you have to actually break carbon bonds and place them on different carbons. So let's take the molecular formula C4H8. The simplest structure is a straight chain. C4. Put in my 4, make sure I have 4 bonds on each carbon. Now place the hydrogens. So there's the structural formula for C4H8. Now, I have to remove a carbon. So you would take one off the end, and you have to place it on a different carbon. If I place it on this one, it's the same. And if I place it on this one, the other end carbon, it's exactly the same as this, but flipped over. So you have to move it to an inside carbon of what's left. There's only one inside carbon, and it's this one. So 1, 2, 3. There's my side group now. We call this an alkyl group when it's not part of the longest carbon chain. Each carbon still makes a total of 4 bonds. So we're adding those lines until we have 4 of them. And then place your hydrogens. Now, these have different structures. I cannot rotate around the bonds to make them go into the other structure. I actually have to pull carbons off and put them in a different place. So, they have different names. This is butane. And this is 2-methyl-propane. So they have different structures and therefore different names. But if you count them, they both have 4 carbons and 8 hydrogens, so they have the same molecular formula, different structural formula, and therefore different names. Okay, stereoisomers occur when atoms and groups of atoms have a different orientation in space. You can have cis-trans isomers or diastomers, and these can only occur when you have a double bond. So what happens is you have a double bond and then you look at the groups that are attached to it. So for this compound, here's your double bond. So you look at the carbons on either side of that double bond. So this carbon on the right has a hydrogen attached to it, and it also has a methyl group. On the other side, there's a hydrogen and a methyl group. So they have 2 different groups on each of the carbon across the double bond. So where the blue lines are, each of those carbons has 2 groups, different groups on it. If we look at the structure on the bottom, here's our double bond. So you look at this carbon and this carbon. These are what we call the carbons across the double bond. And this carbon on the left has 2 hydrogens. So this is not a stereoisomer because each of these carbons has to have 2 different groups. The other carbon has a hydrogen and a 2-carbon chain, an ethyl chain. So this carbon has 2 different groups. This carbon has 2 different groups on it, but this one does not. So this one is not a geometric isomer. This one is. So it has another isomer, another structure that is very similar to this. Now, if you look at the methyl groups, they're on the same side of the double bond. according to where they're placed. So when you have, here's your carbon double bond, you've got 2 hydrogens going up and 2 carbons with 3 hydrogens coming down. These groups are on the same side of the double bond, so we call this cis, a cis isomer. If those methyl groups, those carbons with the hydrogens attached, are on opposite sides of the double bond, then this is called trans. So here is the double bond, and here are the methyl groups, here and here. They're on opposite sides of the double bond, so therefore this is trans. Here's the double bond, and here the methyl groups are on the same side, so that is cis. So look for the 2 different groups, the hydrogen and the methyl group, and are the methyl groups on the same side or opposite sides? That determines whether it's a cis or trans. Geometric isomer. The last type of isomers are enantiomers. These are isomers that are mirror images of each other. And to have these, you must have a carbon with 4 different atoms attached to it. And basically, you can never superimpose the one isomer on top of the other. And that's an enantiomer. You'll come across this again in further organic chemistry studies.